Link's Awakening is the first handheld game in the Zelda series. From this point onwards, most of the 2D games will be handheld, with the main console versions being replaced with 3D games. I'm playing Link's Awakening DX for this video, an enhanced version of the game released for the Game Boy Color. The differences between the two versions are minimal. A single extra dungeon, and of course, vibrant colours replacing the monochromatic palette of the original. With all that in mind, it's time for the evolution of Link's Awakening. The move from the SNES to the Game Boy represents a step backwards in hardware. From 16-bit back to 8-bit, the Game Boy is more akin to a NES than a SNES. The Game Boy does have a few features that pull it ahead of the NES, but those are too technical to go into here. One thing is for certain, it's not on the level of the SNES. A Link to the Past was an ambitious game with far more content than the previous games in the series, so the studio had their work cut out for them. Link's Awakening originally started as a side project to port A Link to the Past to the Game Boy. Initially intended as more of an internal experiment than anything else, the project evolved into its own game with a year and a half of development time. Director Takeshi Tezuka said the less structured development process led to the game being more unrestrained. Aiming to make a spin-off rather than a direct sequel, in an interview with Iwata, Tezuka even said it felt like they were making a parody of a Zelda game. This difference in approach led to Link's Awakening having a different feel to the previous games. This was a good decision, as if the game had been a purely iterative sequel to A Link to the Past, the hardware limitations would have held this game back considerably. While the team managed to squeeze an impressive amount out of the Game Boy's hardware, they also did a good job of making Link's Awakening distinct from the games that came before. There's an offbeat charm to Link's Awakening. One of the first screens of the game features a chain chomp from Mario. It's immediately clear that this will not be like the other games in the series. Where Zelda games up to this point have been relatively serious affairs about saving the world, Link's Awakening embraces a more relaxed tone. This is Link's beach episode, both figuratively and literally. A Link to the Past did feature a few jokes, but Link's Awakening wears its sense of humour on its sleeve. The developers weren't afraid to poke fun at themselves or other Nintendo IPs. At one point you get a Yoshi doll, and the flavour text points out how recently he seems to be showing up in everything. Although the inclusion of Mario characters is the most obvious case, this whimsical atmosphere is carried throughout the entirety of the game. The more relaxed tone is perhaps strongest felt in the story. There's no world-ending conflict this time around, and at no point is there a sense of urgency to complete your quest. That doesn't mean there's no story, however. Link's Awakening's story may be simple, but it's far more interesting than the Save the World story of A Link to the Past. I'm not going to go in-depth on the story, as I want to avoid spoilers. There's less exposition and world-building than in the previous game. Instead, Link's Awakening is more interested in the inhabitants of Koholint Island. The game is heavily NPC-driven, one of the areas where Link's Awakening is more advanced than A Link to the Past. The side stories associated with these NPCs are often short, but nearly always charming. On the surface, Link's Awakening shares a lot of the mechanics of the previous games. It's still a game about finding and conquering dungeons to get magical items which serve some greater purpose. The actual changes in the mechanics are subtle, and mostly a product of a different design philosophy. Many small changes compound to make a game which feels significantly different from the previous games, while still maintaining a lot of what makes Zelda, Zelda. Perhaps the biggest difference from the previous games is the focus away from combat. Both combat and puzzles have been present in every Zelda game, but usually the combat is the focus. That's not the case here. Combat is much easier and rarely serves as a roadblock. That's not to say you won't die in this game, but the combat takes a backseat to the puzzles. There are few, if any, times where the barrier to progress is a combat challenge or gauntlet. The puzzles are the major focus of this game. They're more common, more intricate, and harder than in previous games. At times, Link's Awakening feels like a puzzle game in how it introduces an idea, explores it, and then combines it with the other ideas. None of the puzzles have illogical solutions, and there was never a point where I felt like I had to guess what the designers were thinking. Despite that, Link's Awakening is not without its cryptic puzzles. For example, walls that need to be bombed but have no visible cracks return. You can now check for these based on a sound cue that plays when you hit the wall with your sword, but unless you're stabbing every wall, you need to use context clues to figure out where a secret might be. Most of these cryptic puzzles are optional, but there are some mandatory ones. The focus on puzzles rewards careful observation and experimentation. Often, puzzles are introduced in earlier parts of the game that you have no way of solving until later on. Whenever you get a new item or tool to solve puzzles with, you're encouraged to explore and find uses for it. The downside to this is that often you'll get part way towards the secret and then have to turn back because you don't have the tools to reach it yet. One of the reasons the puzzles are more varied is thanks to the wide range of tools you have at your disposal. Very few of the items in this game are just for combat. I've mentioned before that my favourite items were the ones that change your relationship with the world, and that's almost every item here. Most of the items are familiar, like the hookshot and power bracelet, or they allow you to do something that you could do in previous games, like the boots which let you run. The most notable addition is the Rock's Feather, which allows you to jump. This adds some light platforming to the game, and allows for more interesting design of environments and puzzles. The item design in this game is my favourite of the series so far. There's a focus on mobility and puzzle solving items, which makes every item feel both useful and unique. That's not to say there aren't any combat focused items, but even items like the bow get clever use in puzzles. The items in this game are modular, with even the sword and shield being considered items. You have 2 item slots. You can place your sword in one to attack, but you can also unequip your sword to have combinations of different items. For example, you may wish to equip both the boots and the feather to perform a running jump for more distance. While I did like this freedom to combine items, it is slightly hamstrung by the lack of buttons on the Game Boy. There's a ton of opening the menu to switch items, and it can feel clunky at points. The bosses in Link's Awakening reflect the puzzle-heavy design of the game. While you can die to the bosses, once you know the trick they become trivial. If you enter a boss fight on full health, you usually have enough leeway to test different methods without dying. Zelda 1 also had puzzle-focused bosses, but in that game, the bosses were reused several times. On the repeat fights, you'd already have a strategy for beating them that would often make them easier than normal enemies. Link's Awakening avoids this problem by rarely, if ever, repeating bosses. Every dungeon also has a mini-boss now, meaning there's a ton of unique bosses in this game. There weren't many low points for me. While few of the bosses pose an actual challenge, almost all of them provide an interesting puzzle to solve. This shift does mean that Link's Awakening lacks some of the climactic showdowns of Zelda 2 and A Link to the Past, but it makes the average boss more memorable than those games. There's never a boss that feels like just a stronger version of the enemies you've been fighting, and the game does an overall good job of making its bosses unique. The bosses in Link's Awakening reflect the overall shift to slower paced, puzzle-focused gameplay. The overworld of Link's Awakening is the star of the show. As I mentioned earlier, it's full of areas you'll need to return to later with a different item to access. Where previously you could visit the majority of the world from the start, in Link's Awakening you can access only a small portion of the world. This accessible area gradually opens up as you gain more items. On paper, the world isn't any bigger than A Link to the Past, but in practice it feels huge in comparison. The world in Link's Awakening is difficult to traverse, requiring many items to get around. The fast travel is also more limited in this game, with only a few warp points that require you to manually travel to the closest one. There's also no home point in this game. When you die, you respawn at the last building you entered. This means you can't easily walk back to the start by dying. Koholint Island feels like a maze of different areas where in A Link to the Past you always had the castle as a clear centre point. Having a more Metroidvania style item progression means you spend a lot more time walking around each part of the world. Thankfully, this map is littered with secrets. The sense of exploring and getting familiar with the overworld was already one of the best parts of the Zelda series, and it's the best it's ever been here. This is incentivized by a new collectible type, the seashell. There's a ton of these dotted around, and you're just told that if you collect enough, something good will happen. The reward isn't the point. They're fun to collect, and the game is able to place far more of them than pieces of heart, without breaking the balance. I do think there should have been more types of collectibles, as every collectible building up to a single reward almost guarantees getting that reward will be anticlimactic. The seashells serve a clear purpose to get you to pay more attention to your surroundings, so you're less likely to miss the side content of the game. Most of this stuff is technically optional, but there are parts of the game that would be a struggle if you skipped them. My favourite piece of side content is the long trading quest, which sends you across the world exchanging items with various NPCs. This content gives the game a jokey atmosphere which wasn't present in the previous games. Exploring the overworld was already one of the main parts of Zelda games, but in previous games, dungeons felt like the star of the show. Most of the bigger gameplay moments happened in dungeons, and towards the end of the games you'd be thrown into back-to-back dungeons. That's the opposite here, with the overworld taking more of a focus. Link's Awakening had significantly less dungeons than A Link to the Past, with a total count closer to that of Zelda 1. With Link's Awakening being roughly the same length as A Link to the Past, the gaps between the dungeons are longer. Regardless, dungeons are still a huge part of the game. The layouts are generally simpler than A Link to the Past, but there are some massive ones later on. They follow the same general format as the previous games, but generally contain more puzzles and less combat. As you'd expect, the dungeons are consistently well designed, with few, if any, flaws. An addition to the dungeons this time around are owl statues. After finding the stone beak in each dungeon, you can go to the owl statues for hints. Some of these hints are superfluous, but some of them are almost mandatory. There were rooms that I didn't realise contained puzzles until I got the hint from the owl that made me go back and give it another look. Another welcome addition to the dungeons are teleporters that spawn after defeating mini-bosses. These provide an easy way to and from the entrance to the dungeon. These are especially helpful when you need to backtrack after finding a new item. Zelda 1 featured some short side-scrolling sections within dungeons. These return, but thanks to the new jump ability contain some light 2D platforming. They're still a minor part of the game, but they do help to connect different areas of the dungeon, as well as provide some variety to the gameplay. As you'd expect, dungeons aren't just filled with puzzles. They're also packed with a healthy amount of enemies. The combat in Link's Awakening is similar to the previous games, but much easier. Enemies do less damage, making mistakes less punishing, and unless you're already on low health, it's rare to find a single combat encounter that's difficult enough to kill you. The new items do add some variety to combat, enabling you to perform tricks such as jumping into a crowd of enemies to hit them all with a single spin attack. The shield has been reworked. It's now an active item that you can equip into one of your 2 slots. When you raise your shield, you can block almost everything, taking no damage. Even boss attacks can often be blocked. Despite these additions, it's rare that you'll need to master the combat system in the way that you had to in Zelda 1 or A Link to the Past. The easier combat isn't a bad thing. It complements the game's overall more relaxed tone. Sometimes the combat in the previous games bordered on frustrating, so I can see an argument for making it easier. Ultimately, the less challenging combat fits the exploration and puzzle-solving focus of this game. Combat is the area where you'll most often want to use a variety of items, and that brings me to one of the biggest downsides of this being a Game Boy game. The Game Boy only has 2 face buttons. During combat, if you need to switch items to deal with different enemy types, you'll need to open up the menu to equip the new items. I found myself sometimes doing this several times in a single room. This can be clunky and frustrating. Once I got used to the art style, I actually liked the way the game looked. The visual fidelity is a clear step down from A Link to the Past, but it's a great looking game for the hardware. It really is the lack of buttons on the Game Boy that holds this game back more than anything else. Having played the game, Nintendo choosing to remake it on the Switch makes a lot of sense. So far in the series, this is the game which has been hindered the most by the hardware it's on. I'm interested in trying out the Switch remake at some point to see how that game handles item selection. Regardless of the minor control annoyances, Link's Awakening is still a phenomenal game. I can certainly see why some people prefer it to A Link to the Past. It's a unique experience with a different tone and focus to the previous games, while avoiding Zelda 2's problem of not feeling like it fits within the series. This is a fantastic game that deserves its label as a classic. In the next episode of the Evolution of Zelda, I'm going to be playing Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64. This is going to be a big episode, as the jump to 3D is possibly the biggest moment in the series. My upload schedule is sporadic at best anyway, so don't be surprised if the next episode is a month or 2 away. The next episode will definitely be coming though, so stay subscribed if you don't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.